For 11 days in May 1969, American soldiers fought inch by inch up a jungle-covered hill in Vietnam's Asha Valley. Every inch was paid for with bloods of the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles. They were attacked by the enemy and friendly troops alike, yet they endured, and when they finally reached the summit, the order came down to abandon it. What began as a simple military objective became one of the most infamous battles of the Vietnam War, and a moment that made a nation question the true cost of victory. In the aftermath of the Battle of Hue, the intelligence and combat reports confirmed that many enemy units attacking Hue had staged and supplied from the Asha Valley. Weapons caches, food supplies, and communication lines that supported the siege of Hue were routed right through this valley. The Asha Valley lay deep in the western mountains of South Vietnam, near the border of Laos. Surrounded by rugged jungle and steep terrain, it stretched more than 45 kilometers and was an important communication line between the Ho Chi Minh Trail network, moving North Vietnamese troops and supplies south. Hidden under thick jungle canopy, the valley offered natural protection for transports, storage areas, and entire regiments of soldiers. As such, the valley remained mostly untouched by American forces. After the fall of the Asha Special Forces camp in 1966, the North Vietnamese built an entire network of bunkers, laid communication lines, and turned the area into a stronghold. After several failed attempts to eliminate the enemy presence in the valley, first by the 1st Cavalry Division in Operation Delaware and later by the 101st Airborne Division in Operation Somerset Plain, the U.S. military command in South Vietnam knew that disrupting North Vietnamese logistics would require a new push with sustained pressure. That is, if they wanted to prevent another surprise offensive like Tet was. By 1969, General Richard Stilwell, commanding the 24th Corps, devised a plan to force the enemy out. The operation was named Apache Snow. It would involve multiple battalions from the 101st Airborne Division and ARVN forces, whose goal would be to sweep the valley from north to south. The plan to launch a multi-battalion combat assault aimed not only to engage the enemy, but to dismantle all their staging areas and supply lines. It was a typical reconnaissance and force operation. With the Asha Valley located in the 1st Corps Tactical Zone, the task of conducting the operation was given to the 24th Corps, specifically the 101st Airborne Division Airmobile, commanded by Major General Melvin Zais. Since the operation was to be conducted in an inaccessible area, Major General Zais decided to engage the enemy with airmobile units trained for helicopter assaults and fast movement over rugged terrain. The 3rd Brigade assigned for the task consisted of 3 infantry battalions. 1st Battalion 506th Infantry, the Currahees, 2nd Battalion 501st Infantry, the Geronimos, and 3rd Battalion 187th Infantry, the Rakkasans. Each of these air-mobile battalions had 4 rifle companies and support elements, including mortars, medics, and communications teams. The 3rd Brigade was backed by divisional artillery, 1 105mm direct support battalion, and 3 batteries providing 105mm and 155mm general support. They also had an aerial rocket artillery battalion with Cobra helicopters. For transport and medevac, the 101st Division Aviation Group fielded 3 helicopter battalions. Additional support came from the 217th Cavalry for recon and rescue. Apart from the U.S. troops, the South Vietnamese were also to participate in the operation with several battalions from the 1st and 3rd Regiments of the 1st ARVN Division. The main enemy was the 29th Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army's 324th Division. This elite unit, known as the Pride of Ho Chi Minh, had fought at Hue in 1868. By May 1969, it had between 1,200 and 1,800 men in 3 battalions. Its soldiers were seasoned warriors, hardened by years of jungle warfare, mountain campaigns, and defensive operations along the Laotian border. The intelligence reported that the brunt of the enemy forces was located on Hill 937, a steep, isolated ridge on the mountain that locals call Dong Ap Bia, or the Mountain of the Crouching Beast. Unlike other elevations in the Asha Valley, Dong Ap Bia was not part of a larger chain. It stood alone, surrounded by deep jungle and narrow valleys. Its sides were covered in dense triple canopy rainforest. Beneath the tallest trees grew smaller trees, thick vines, and tangled bamboo that made movement and visibility extremely difficult. The mountain's isolated shape and position on the western edge of the northern Asha Valley made it a natural strongpoint. To the west lay the Trungpham River and the Laotian border. The south ran the Raulao River. From Dongat Bia, enemy forces controlled movement across the entire valley. Because of this, the North Vietnamese Army PAVN constructed dense layered fortifications on Hill 937 that made it extremely difficult to assault. They dug bunker complexes into the slopes of the hill using logs, earth, and foliage to reinforce and camouflage their positions. The bunkers were built in multiple rows, often in concentric defensive rings, allowing overlapping fields of fire from different elevations and directions. Soldiers from each line of bunkers could fall back to another pre-prepared position. Bunkers were supplemented with spider holes, trenches, and tunnel systems that allowed fast movement between firing positions and cover from artillery and airstrikes. Tunnel networks were dug deep into the mountain and included supply caches, command posts, hospitals, and sleeping areas. The entire area was heavily booby-trapped with Soviet-made Mon 100 Claymore mines. Many trails and likely approach routes were mined or covered by concealed positions with automatic weapons and RPG gunners. On key ridgelines and fingers of the hill, the PAVN placed machine guns, including 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns, which acted as both anti-aircraft and ground support weapons. Recoilless rifles and 82mm mortars were set to cover choke points and landing zones. American soldiers later described the mountain as honeycombed with defenses. The complex made Hill 937 one of the most heavily fortified positions U.S. forces encountered during the war. On May 10, 1969, Operation Apache Snow began with one of the largest airmobile assaults of the Vietnam War. After the intense shelling campaign and AH-1G Cobra gunship airstrikes, 65 UH-1H Huey helicopters lifted off from Firebase Blaze in formation, carrying 3 battalions from the 101st Airborne Division and 2 South Vietnamese ARVN battalions. The helicopters flew low through the valley and delivered the troops into different sectors of the northern Asha. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, was inserted near the Laotian border. Their mission was to cut off PAVN infiltration routes and block movement along Route 548. Once on the ground, the battalion CP and 3 rifle companies secured their LZ, then moved out to conduct reconnaissance and force operations headed toward the west. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, was assigned to secure Hill 137. The Rakkasans began their assault at 0844. Delta Company landed first, followed by the battalion headquarters, which set up its command post about 1 kilometer away from the summit. Alpha Company was sent northwest and Charlie Company moved southwest to begin searching their sectors. Both companies quickly found fresh bunkers and huts, with cooking fires still burning, signs that North Vietnamese troops had just pulled out. At 1600 hours, Bravo Company, held in reserve at Firebase Blaze, was released to reinforce 3-187th. 16 helicopters brought them in, but 1 aircraft caught fire and crash-landed in the valley. After landing, Bravo Company came under immediate small arms attack. The company then moved uphill to join the battalion and dug in for the night. Elsewhere, the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry, landed near the Laotian border. 3 ARVN battalions were also inserted northwest of the mountain. These South Vietnamese units began sweeping operations towards suspected enemy locations in support of the American attack. By nightfall, all U.S. and ARVN forces had inserted into the valley. The fight for Hill 137 had begun. On the morning of May 11th, the 3-187th resumed its push toward Hill 937. Captain Charles Littinen led Bravo Company up the northern ridge of the mountain, with 1st Lieutenant Frank Bochia's 1st Platoon leading the way. Along the trail, they found signs of a recent fight, dead North Vietnamese soldiers, discarded weapons, and blood trails. With the help of a scout named Vin, they identified the enemy as the 29th PAVN Regiment. Everything suggested that the Americans were walking into a heavily occupied zone. Despite the growing tension due to the presence of a formidable enemy, Captain Lieutenant ordered the company to move forward. Shortly after 1600, 4th Platoon ran into a sudden burst of automatic fire on RPGs. A devastating fire forced the platoon to pull back and recover the wounded under fire. Lieutenant called in artillery and Cobra gunships. That's when disaster struck. The gunships mistakenly opened fire at the battalion's command post. 2 Americans were killed and 35 were wounded, including the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, who took a shrapnel in the back. As if friendly fire was not enough, moments later Pavan mortars landed on the command post, followed by a small ground assault, which the U.S. troops managed to drive back. Honeycutt now had no doubt that the mountain was heavily defended, probably by an entire Pavan regiment dug in and ready. He ordered Bravo Company to pull back 100 meters and prepare to attack again. The following day, Alpha and Charlie Company spent advancing along their assigned paths, while Bravo Company, which had taken heavy fire on the previous day, held its position and prepared for a renewed assault. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt, despite being wounded by friendly fire, refused evacuation and focused on setting up the next attack. On May 13th, as the troops got into position, U.S. artillery pounded the upper slopes. Air Force Sky Raiders followed, dropping napalm and 500-pound bombs. Once again, Lieutenant Bochia's platoon from Bravo Company led the attack. They reached the edge of a clearing when a North Vietnamese bunker opened fire. Dozens of Pavan soldiers swarmed from spider holes, firing RPGs and machine guns. 6 Americans were hit within seconds. The platoon fell back under cover as Cobra gunships and artillery returned fire. But during one air pass, a bomb landed short and struck B Company. 1 soldier was killed and several were wounded. Meanwhile, Charlie Company was hit with RPGs fired into the treetops. Shrapnel rained down from above, wounding many men. The company got pinned down by an overlapping bunker fire. Further south, as Delta Company moved through dense jungle toward its assault position, they were attacked by Pavan mortars and RPGs. A medevac helicopter was called in, but as it hovered to pick up the wounded, it was struck by an RPG. The helicopter crashed and exploded. 6 men were killed, including all crew members and wounded soldiers. By the end of the day, all 3 attacking companies were stalled. Casualties were mounting. Enemy fire from bunkers, trenches, and tree lines made movement slow and dangerous. When the night fell, Honeycutt ordered all units to pull back slightly and dig in. The enemy showed no signs of retreating. On the contrary, they seemed determined to make the Americans bleed for every inch of the hill. Hamburger Hill. On May 14th, the 3187th launched another assault on Hill 937. The soldiers were exhausted, but the orders were clear: push toward the summit. All 3 rifle companies moved uphill through thick jungle and steep terrain. Artillery and airstrikes pounded the ridgelines in front of them. Cobra gunships flew in close to attack enemy bunkers, but even with the support, the advance was slow and costly. The enemy showed a fierce resistance, firing from hidden bunkers, trenches, and spider holes. Moving through the thick growth, American soldiers struggled to see the enemy until they were almost on top of their bunkers. Fire was coming from multiple directions at once. The worst part was that the thick foliage prevented helicopter pilots from distinguishing friend from foe on the ground. Once again, a helicopter gunship misfired by sending its rockets close to U.S. lines, killing 1 American and wounding 3 others. It was the height of the confusion and chaos that reigned on the mountain. By the end of the day, the Americans were once again brought to a halt. The cost was high: 12 dead and over 80 wounded, and the summit was still in enemy hands. The men could see the top, but they couldn't reach it. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt insisted on keeping the pressure on the hill. Tomorrow, Bravo Company made one more push toward the summit of Hill 937. That day, they got closer than ever, within 150 meters of the top. But as they closed in, disaster struck again. A misdirected airstrike landed on their position. 2 soldiers were killed. 14 more were wounded. The mistake broke momentum. The unit had no choice but to fall back and regroup. Soldiers couldn't believe that this was the 4th time they were hit by their own forces in just a couple of days. On May 16th, the 3187th did not attack. After days of grinding losses, Colonel Honeycutt decided to pause. His companies were spread thin, and the enemy was still well dug in. He waited for the 1506th to move closer before making another push. That day, the Currahees made a small progress by capturing adjacent Hill 916, but they were still 2 kilometers from the main objective, Hill 937. Instead of another assault, the Americans decided to engage the enemy with devastating firepower. Jets dropped bombs on the summit. Cobra gunships fired rockets into tree lines. Artillery from nearby fire bases pounded suspected bunker sites around the clock. The shelling took the mountain. Trees were blasted apart. Smoke and dust rose from the ridge, but the North Vietnamese remained silent. They stayed hidden in their bunkers, waiting for the enemy to come back. What Honeycutt wanted was to soften the defenses before sending his men back up. The fight was not over, yet men of the 187th were on the verge of collapse. Days of fighting on Hamburger Hill had taken a heavy toll. Bravo, Charlie, and Delta companies were down to half strength. Some platoons had fewer than 20 men. To fill the gaps, replacements were flown in. However, most of the men who arrived were not infantry. They were clerks, cooks, mechanics, troops who had never seen combat. They were handed rifles and ammo and sent up the mountain. What the newcomers saw was the scene of a devastated land and exhausted men. One GI described the experience of fighting on the hill like being put through a meat grinder. Because of this, men began calling Hill 937 Hamburger Hill. The name spread quickly through the ranks. It captured the brutal, grinding nature of the battle. Every day, troops went up the mountain and were cut down by machine guns, RPGs, and mortar. Fire came from above, from the side, and from below. The enemy made them take the same ground again and again, but the hill didn't give in. Instead, it ground the men down. The horrors of Hamburger Hill were vividly described by J. Shau, a reporter from the Associated Press who arrived at the battlefield during the bitterest of fighting. For the first time, eyes of the outside world were on Hamburger Hill. Shau was flown in by helicopter and taken to the base of the mountain. He saw the mud, the blood, and burned trees. He saw the wounded carried on stretchers. He talked to soldiers who had been climbing and fighting for over a week. Many were angry. They didn't understand why they were still attacking the hill. Some said it wasn't worth it. Others didn't want to talk at all. Shau's report would soon go out to news desks across the world. It was a shocking revelation of what the war in Vietnam really was, one that fueled an already growing debate back home. But on the mountain, the war went on. The men of the 187th prepared to climb again. Some looked scared, others just followed orders. The next assault was coming. Everyone knew it. The only question was how many would make it back down. On May 18th, the assault on Hill 937 resumed. It was supposed to be preceded by an airstrike on the summit, which arrived 30 minutes late. The delay disrupted the attack schedule, but it was nothing compared to the artillery strike that followed. American howitzers shelled the hill with high explosive rounds and CS gas. While explosive shells hit the target, those containing gas fell short and hit the Alpha Company's position. Within seconds, soldiers began coughing, choking, and vomiting. The unit's momentum was broken before the attack even began. Despite this, Alpha and Delta companies climbed the ridge and tried to push forward. As they neared the bunkers, the enemy opened fire from hidden positions. Delta Company was hit hard. Almost half of its men were killed or wounded in the attack, forcing the survivors to fall back under the cover of artillery. Charlie Company attempted to move as well, but as the rain grew heavier, the mud turned slopes into rivers. At brigade headquarters, Major General Zayce faced growing pressure. Reports showed heavy losses and a decline in morale. He even considered ending the assault, but instead ordered 3 more battalions from the 501st Infantry and the ARVN into the fight. The hill had to be taken no matter the cost. On May 19th, progress finally came. At 1300 hours, the 1506th Infantry captured Hill 900, a key rise near the objective. However, a follow-up push toward the summit ran into immediate fire from enemy bunkers that blocked the path. That day, Private First Class Paul Skaggs made the difference. Crawling under fire, he reached a bunker and threw grenades into the opening. When his rifle jammed, he drew his pistol and fired at the enemy troops inside. He knocked out several positions and cleared the path for the rest of the platoon. The men finally tightened their grip on the mountain. On May 20th, the final assault on Hill 937 began at first light. 10 U.S. artillery battalions opened fire across Dong Ap Bia. Over 20,000 rounds slammed into the mountain, smashing trees and tearing apart bunker lines. At the same time, Air Force and Navy jets launched 272 airstrikes. More than 1 million pounds of bombs, napalm, and high explosives were dropped on the summit and ridgelines. Smoke and dust blanketed the jungle. Once the barrage ended, ground units moved out. From the north, Alpha and Charlie companies of the 3 187th led the main attack. To their northeast and southeast, the 2 501st Infantry and the 2/3 ARVN Battalion advanced to support the assault and seal off the routes. At 11:45 hours, after heavy fighting, Charlie Company broke through to the summit. It had been 9 days and 5 hours since the first contact on the hill. They climbed to the top under fire, finding trenches and bunkers, blasted but still dangerous. The enemy, resisting to the end, engaged the Americans in bunker-to-bunker fighting. Some positions had to be taken with grenades and flamethrowers. In one sector, troops found ARVN soldiers chained to trees. Some were dead, others barely alive. They had been left behind the North Vietnamese as human shields. As the day went on, more companies reached the summit. By 1700 hours, Dong Lap Bia was declared secure. After 11 days of combat, the U.S. Army and ARVN forces controlled Hill 937. The cost had been high, though. The dead were everywhere, both North Vietnamese and American. Over 10 days of brutal fighting, American forces suffered 72 killed in action and more than 370 wounded. Most of these casualties were concentrated among the assault lines, especially the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, which bore the brunt of the frontal attacks. On the other side, U.S. intelligence estimated that over 630 North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. Most of these body counts came from battlefield inspections, intercepted radio traffic, and captured documents. But the true number remains uncertain. Many of the PAVN dead were buried in collapsed bunkers or carried away during the night. Despite the high cost and intense combat, the hill was abandoned by American forces shortly after its capture. Such a great sacrifice suddenly felt meaningless. After the capture of Hill 937, reporters began sending stories that shocked the American public. Many questioned the purpose of the assault. The media coverage caused a wave of public anger. Photos showed exhausted, bloodied soldiers. Headlines questioned the point of the mission. When it became known that the U.S. forces abandoned the hill shortly after taking it, the reaction turned worse. Critics asked why so many lives had been spent on Apache jungle that was given up just days later. In Congress, Senator Ted Kennedy called the battle senseless and irresponsible. He said no military goal could justify such high losses. The Army responded that the objective had been met, the enemy was disrupted, and their base destroyed. But to many Americans, the reasoning sounded hollow. The Battle of Hamburger Hill became one of the most controversial battles of the war. What's more, it became a turning point in how the war was managed. Within weeks of the battle, public support shifted. The cost of keeping large U.S. units in Vietnam was now harder to justify. President Richard Nixon began pushing harder for his policy of Vietnamization, a gradual withdrawal of U.S. ground troops and turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese forces. The soldiers who fought and bled on Hamburger had fought through fire and rain. They weren't fighting for the land. They were fighting for each other. They didn't ask for medals, but they didn't want it to be dismissed either. To the men who fought, that hill was real. The losses were real. They had done what they were sent to do, and that counted, even if others didn't understand it. They accomplished their mission to the highest traditions of the 101st Airborne's Screaming Eagles decorated history. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the Militology Channel for more. Stay tuned.